second panelist for today, who earned her PhD from UNC Chapel Hill in '92, is a professor emerita in the Department of History, Politics, and Global Studies. She has written a variety of articles on the Alsatian communities from the 17th to the 19th century, including publishing some in European History Quarterly, French History, and has a variety of publications in the process of publication. We'll look forward to those, particularly a book project, Religion, Memories, National Identity for Catholics and Protestants in France. I know I mumbled the title, pardon me. I know Rebecca as well, below these many conferences. She's a fabulous scholar, and we look forward to what she has to say. Thank you so much. Thank you.
St. Bartholomew's Day, August 1572, was the iconic massacre of the Wars of Religion. Roughly 250 years later, the White Terror of 1815 to 1818 took place in the context of civil war in the Midi, as the regime of the 100 Days collapsed. It marked the last major episode in a repeated cycle of religious violence in southern France. Despite the distance in time, the memories of St. Bartholomew's Day constituted a point of reference for both Catholics and Protestants. The importance of St. Bartholomew's Day in the discourse of 1815 raises questions about memory and how it was handed down, its centrality to the ways in which Catholics and Protestants of Lower Languedoc understood the cycles of sectarian violence, and the ways in which the events of 1572 had become an integral part of stories that the French told about their past. As tensions mounted in 1814, implicit and explicit memories of the Wars of Religion in St. Bartholomew's, already revived in 1789, increased fears and shaped events. From the outset, Protestants were uneasy because the Bourbon Charter altered the Concordat in organic articles which had guaranteed liberty of conscience and freedom of worship. Whereas the Concordat had stated Catholicism to be the religion of the majority, the Charter reinstated Catholicism as a state religion, albeit with provisions guaranteeing freedom of conscience and the right to public worship. In addition, the Charter changed the Concordat's prescriptions on public Catholic processions. Protestants were disappointed because the Charter represented this step backward. Nonetheless, they supported the Bourbons because they were tired of endless warfare and economic instability. Conversely, Catholics felt vindicated by the Charter, which they saw as finally giving them complete religious liberty and led them to believe that they had won and the Protestants had lost. The prefect warned that each group, due to the long history of hostility, was afraid of a recurrence and was afraid of each other. He also reported that, quote, "Their songs are always about chopping off the entrails of Protestants for stew," unquote. By October 1814, the Protestant mayor Nîmes was much more worried, writing that agitators were, quote unquote, organizing a terror and again going to devastate France through all the horrors of anarchy, unquote. In the small towns of the Guard, there was talk of another St. Bartholomew's Day even before the 100 Days. The landing of Napoleon on the eve of March 1815 began a period of outright civil war and religious polarization. Due to the increasingly bellicose rhetoric from extreme Catholic royalists and fears that the Bourbons would not protect them, Protestants accepted the Bonapartist regime. The authorities reported Protestant harassment of Catholics, celebrations with farandoles, and insults and provocative songs. Catholics in the street of Nîmes sang that they would, quote, "wash their hands in the blood of Protestants," unquote. From the Catholic areas of the Guard, royalist peasants, known as McCoy, streamed to Nîmes to join the Duke of Angoulême's royalist army. These forces departed Nîmes in late March 1815, with the goal of countering Napoleon's forces at Lyon. Within weeks, they were defeated and sowed terror as they retreated through the countryside. Many of the royalist soldiers had to traverse predominantly Protestant villages of the Guard to reach home, often the same ones they had terrorized as they had marched off to war just a few weeks prior. At Arpiarguez, panic-stricken Protestant peasants assaulted the Catholic troops as they approached, resulting in 14 deaths. The violence at Arpiarguez enraged Catholic royalists and became a justification for the violence of the White Terror. As the news of Waterloo and the immediate collapse of Napoleon's regime became obvious, violence mounted. Following an old pattern, Catholic and Protestant paramilitaries, recruited by elites, clashed in Nîmes and Montpellier. Authority rested in the Duke of Angoulême and his followers, who he immediately appointed as commissioners to the various southern departments. They also created an all-Catholic National Guard and other southern departments. Efforts by the authorities in Nîmes to persuade Bonapartist soldiers in the barracks to lay down their weapons and evacuate the city in late July 1815 led to the explosion of violence known as the White Terror. Persuaded to lay down arms and leave the city peacefully, the arrival of Angoulême's Nicolet and bands of Catholic peasants led to a massacre of the soldiers. These events then set up killing, arbitrary arrests, looting, assaults on women, and burning across Nîmes. Violence then spread to the countryside, where bands burned vineyards, looted farms, and murdered the proprietors and their families. Some of the violence was clearly orchestrated by bands led by Nicolet, who were connected with ultra-royalist secret societies and Angoulême's appointees, or mobilized through clientage networks. Much of the violence in Nîmes and the region around the city was the work of Catholic royalist Jacques Dupont. His nom de guerre, Retelling, meant 3 morsels, and explicitly alluded to his threats to chop Protestants into pieces. At Uzès, another former Nicolet and Catholic royalist, Jacques Raffin, took the name Quatre Taillons, or 4 morsels. Violence was also encouraged and even planned by the Catholic royalist officials so as to bring about a purge of local officials. Jules Caballère, the prefect, planned to use the National Guard to instigate a prison massacre in Nîmes, which was intended to be a repeat of St. Bartholomew's, although this did not happen. Some of the violence, however, was spontaneous, resulting from local grievances. Repeating a pattern of violence that dated back to the 16th century, Catholic villagers attacked Protestant temples, some of which were former Catholic churches. Some Protestants also converted. Refugees streamed out of Nîmes to the Protestant strongholds in the Bonnage, Gardonesse, Cévennes, and further afield to Lyon, Paris, and some to England. The stories of violence brought by the mass of refugees in the Gardonesse heightened fear and led villagers to mobilize for defense. For example, an anonymous letter from the Protestant majority town of Saint-Hippolyte in August 1815 attested that in Nîmes the, quote, Papists were making war on the Protestants and that they wanted a St. Bartholomew's Day. More surprisingly, Catholics also used the imagery. Antoine Vidal, the police commissioner, reported to the Minister of Police about fears of another St. Bartholomew's massacre. In late July 1815, as the violence intensified, a police informant, in reference to the pillaging and assassinations of Montpellier and Nîmes, warned that if Protestant peasants from the Cévennes descended on Nîmes to take revenge, there could be, quote unquote, a torrent of blood, a civil war, and another St. Bartholomew's Day, one that was worse than the original. This official turned the memory of a Catholic massacre of Protestants into a Catholic fear of victimization by Protestants. The memory had become a symbolic stand-in for religious hatreds on both sides and an image of the worst that could happen. Some of the worst violence occurred around the anniversary of St. Bartholomew's on August 24th. The election to the new Chamber of Deputies took place on August 22nd. One of the Catholic royalist objectives was to use terror to regain control of departmental politics, which they had enjoyed during the period of the Revocation and lost with the Bagarre de Nîmes in 1790. The goal of violence and terror were to prevent Protestant electors from voting. Indeed, 60 Protestant electors were unable to do so, and others voted under threat to their lives. Their absence ensured that the most extreme partisans of Angoulême were elected. After the elections and as St. Bartholomew's Day approached, the violence escalated. In response to rumors circulated through the Gardonesse about a Catholic massacre, Protestant villagers assembled at the crossroads of Ners to defend themselves. On October 24th, the anniversary of St. Bartholomew's, the authorities at Nîmes sent troops, with Nicolet led by Trétaillon and their aide, to pacify the Protestants. The Protestants fired on the royalist troops and Nicolet. In turn, the authorities sent the newly arrived Austrian army, which shot and killed the assembled peasants. Those arrested were taken to Nîmes, and several summarily executed in public. Like Archierages, the violence at Ners became another incident that the Catholic royalists used to justify repression and quote themselves as victims. The episode at Ners confirmed the Protestant conviction that there was a deliberate campaign against them, as there actually was. In the wake of the shooting at Ners, Quatre Taillons unleashed another wave of violence at Uzès and its surroundings. After terrorizing the countryside, he raided the prison and shot 6 prisoners on the square as the mayor hid in terror. Reprisals followed with the murder of a Catholic priest and an elector returning from Nîmes. Catholics in Uzès, remembering that Ners had been a center of Camisard activity, fled into the countryside to hide. After Nears, the government in Paris began to rein in Angoulême and made efforts to impose order. Nonetheless, episodes of violence continued well into the fall and beyond. In November 1815, General Lagarde, sent to control a mob as a Protestant temple in Nîmes reopened, was assassinated by a Catholic royalist with the support of the authorities. More sporadic violence continued into 1816 and 1817, and the repression lasted even longer. Authorities subjected Protestants to higher taxes than Catholics, continual searches for arms, arbitrary arrests, and quartering of troops. Consistories rarely met during this period. As in the past, the government tried to force Protestants to decorate for Protestant processions through their neighborhoods as a sign of their submission. Although many perpetrators of the violence were arrested and some tried, the prejudices of the royalist judges and witness intimidation led to the acquittal of most of the Catholic royalist offenders. Most often, it was the Protestants who were imprisoned and tried before special tribunals. Memories of St. Bartholomew's Day were central during the White Terror and shaped events through fear and rituals of violence. Protestant memories from the immediate aftermath of St. Bartholomew days were also overlaid with those of subsequent events and the cycle of sectarian violence and repression that had played out over the next 2.5 centuries. These subsequent events formed new layers of memory: the League, Wars of Rohan, Revocation, defeat of the Camisards. Each new set of experience and horrors altered the memory and meaning of what had happened previously. Catholics had their own layered memories too. Although they clearly referenced the massacre of St. Bartholomew's in 1815, it was an uncomfortable memory because they were the perpetrators, and it reinforced the stereotype of Catholic fanaticism. The Micolade of 1567, the Camisard revolt, and the anti-Catholic violence of the Bagarre Nîmes in 1790 were much more important because these were events in which they were the victims and the source of their fears about Protestants. The Revolution provided another dimension to the cycle of violence and added to the layers of Catholic memory. Protestant attainment of civil status and legalization of their public worship reinstated a group that Catholics had repressed in 1685. The Revolution invoked fears that they would seek revenge. The Bagarre of Nîmes confirmed their fears and became conflated with Catholic memories of the Micolade, especially as the revolutionary events took place in front of the bishop's palace, just as in 1567. Catholic fears intensified with the seizure of church lands, the closure of the monasteries, and the civil constitution of the clergy. The importance of memory carried from the wars of religion to the 19th century does not mean that these are accurate reflections of what actually happened. What became important at the time and afterwards was often the perception and not the actual events. Writing on memory in the aftermath of World War I, Jay Winter has argued that people formulate stories to process their experiences. They then rehearse or retell the stories to themselves and others so that the memories change over time. Drawing on research on the Holocaust is applied to such different episodes of violence as St. Bartholomew's, the 1792 September massacres, and the terror. Timothy Tackett, Mark Greengrass, and Ronan Steinberg have shown that only in the aftermath of violence do participants come to terms with what had happened. In many cases, the victims are simply too traumatized to address the events or talk about them. In the immediate aftermath of St. Bartholomew's Day massacres, as in 1815, survivors had to process the trauma involved and then shape their stories in ways that helped them to make sense of their experiences. This process shaped individual memories, but also an official one. In both the massacre of St. Bartholomew's and the White Terror of 1815, the sources available to historians were shaped by official attempts to control the story. People who might have acquiesced to the violence due to fear and uncertainty in the heat of the moment began to take a step back and reconsider what had happened and explain their role to themselves and others. In the aftermath of the 1815 White Terror, both Catholics and Protestants engaged in this process of formulating explanatory narratives and deciding meaning. They invoked St. Bartholomew's as a way to understand what had happened, albeit in different ways. Protestants had little opportunity to shape the official story of what happened in 1815 due to ongoing repression. They clearly saw the violence as religious persecution and a throwback to the wars of religion generally, and St. Bartholomew's in particular. Protestants were reluctant to report what was happening in the heat of the moment or tell their stories in court. The reports of the local officials, the police, and even police spies demonstrate the degree to which they were under surveillance and subjected to quartering troops, denunciations, and arbitrary arrests. Direct accounts from Protestants are therefore rare and usually take the form of anonymous letters. The clearest account of the Protestant perspective comes indirectly via the reports of English observers. As rumors of the events in the south of France reached England in fall 1815, a committee of dissenting British ministers decried the violence to fellow Protestants. To gather more information, they sent Clément Perrault to the south of France for 10 weeks to report on the events. Perrault's report was based on interviews with Protestants in the Midi. Most of the sources were anonymous to protect them from reprisals and judicial action. The report captured the Protestant sense of persecution, victimhood, and their betrayal by the French government. Because Catholic royalists held power during and in the aftermath of 1815, they were ultimately the ones who created the records and shaped the official story. As the violence receded in the fall of 1815, Catholic royalist officials also made frequent references to St. Bartholomew Day, but in order to justify their roles. René Bernice, one of Angoulême's commissioners, and the prefect, Marquis d'Arbaujuc, wrote memoirs to challenge Perrault and justify their own conduct. Okay. Several themes are common to both authors. They rejected the charge that the White Terror had been akin to St. Bartholomew's Day and that it was a persecution of Protestants. Both authors argued, as did many Catholic royalist officials, that ordinary Catholics in the Nicolay were exasperated at what they experienced at the hands of Protestants. They argued that they had done everything possible to restrain the Catholics. Bernier denied that Catholic royalists believed that only one party could win and the other be completely eliminated. Yet this Manichaean logic, dated back to the 16th century, had been the claimed reality after 1685 and had been revived by Catholic royalists in 1790. It was still a factor in 1815, at least in shaping perceptions and mobilizing peasants. Bernier and Arbaujuc also maintained that the true victims had been the royalist soldiers in the Nicolay, citing the events at Arpiargues and Narst as evidence. Their accounts also referred very explicitly to the Bagarre of Nîmes in 1790 and Protestant political power during most of the revolution as evidence that the Protestants were simply disgruntled at no longer being in charge. To shape the narratives that the events of 1815 were not religious in nature, both authors, as well as other Catholic royalists, used coded language. Royalists, volunteers, and Nicolay stood in for the Catholics. In some cases, they obviously referred to Catholics by identifying the geographic origin of actors, areas around Nîmes for Catholic peasants. For Protestants, they used the majority Protestant regions of the Bonnage, Ardennes, and Cévennes. Another common way to avoid identifying the groups in religious terms was to refer to the good two-thirds and the bad third of the population, a fairly obvious code for the religious breakdown of the Guard. Given that they labeled the events as purely political, they also identified Protestants or Protestant communes negatively as factieux, which in the context of 1815 meant both religious and political disunity. They also labeled the Protestants as terrorists and Bonapartists. This language ignored the actual facts of Protestant political loyalties. The Catholic royalists themselves deliberately created the myth of a Bonapartist conspiracy to justify the repression during and after 1815. Some of the Bonapartist propaganda in circulation came from Catholic royalists who wanted to create new pretexts for repression. Officials also acknowledged in their dispatches that they were deliberately choosing their language. For example, in the middle of the violence at Uzès, an official urged the government to play down the religious element in the violence and present what was happening in a favorable, that is, a political light.
We need to move toward it.
Yeah. The euphemism in the sources has shaped the long-term narrative by leading some historians to accept the claim at face value that the White Terror was primarily political. Yet this interpretation overlooks that the most pressing political issues were also religious. So I'm going to skip the section on national identity, but the point of it is that Protestants and Catholics both saw this as essential to how the French saw themselves, that they didn't want to see themselves in the 19th century post-Enlightenment and post-Revolution as fanatics or indulging in religious persecution. And this was particularly important for the Restoration, which defined loyalty and true Frenchness as being loyal to the Charter, which guaranteed tolerance. So in conclusion, the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day of 1572 provided a lens through which Catholics and Protestants in southern France could explain the events of 1815 and its aftermath and formulate a narrative about it. The implicit memory of the massacre provided time-honored rituals of violence in Midi. Between 1572 and 1815, many layers of memory had intervened as the French played out a cycle of sectarian violence. These memories came together once more in 1815, now aggravated by the hatred survived during the French Revolution and reinvigorated in the collapse of authority of 1814 to 1815. Yet in 1815, St. Bartholomew provided an example of what was supposed to have changed as they accepted the principle of religious liberty as embedded in the Charter. A St. Bartholomew's was supposed to be forgotten. In the aftermath of 1572 and 1815, the French again found that oubli did not work, and that massacre and its subsequent iterations cast a long shadow over the history and how it's been told. Thank you.